Hi, everyone. It's Rob Gray from ASU and the Perception Action Podcast, again, back with another article review. Today, I want to look at the topic of representative design and kind of what are the effects of having, different degrees of representativeness. Is having a really low representative practice going to hurt, right? How much is having a higher representative practice going to help, right? I think these are important questions that we need to consider and research for understanding this more. Because, as we've talked about multiple times on the podcast, you can't always achieve purposeful, perfect representative design, right? You need to move away from the game for various reasons, planned or unplanned. For example, not being able to train on a field and have to do more training at home. So we want to look at kind of what are the effects of these different things. So kind of as a basic review, I've covered representative design a bunch of times on the podcast now. It's an idea first proposed by Brunswick, and basically it's the degree to which practice represents what's going on in training. And the idea, of course, is that the more representative, the closer training is to the practice conditions, the more transfer of training you're going to get. The more practice is going to benefit what happens in competition or the game. Critically, what's important is the factors. There's certain aspects of the factors that are important, not everything, right? There's a bunch of superficial things that are going to be irrelevant, whether they're different or the same between practice and competition. So there's certain components that we want to be the same, and people divide these into different things. I like to talk about it in terms of three things, right? So one is the degree of perception action coupling or decouplings, to what extent my movements in practice are driven by information. Second, that information, the specifying information that's going to be available in the game, right? So let me give you an example of the sport we're going to look at that was in the study today, baseball, right? So when you hit off a pitching machine, the action is coupling, right? There's good coupling there. Your swing is driven by the information, the flight of the ball. But the information is not really specifying, because if the pitching machine is set on the same speed every time, it creates an information variable, the size of the ball, the distance away from plate, that you can use that's not usable in the actual game. Sometimes we call this a visual motor mapping. Bill Warren likes to call this, right? So for me, it's important to separate those two things. And the last one is action fidelity, right? The extent to which the task dynamics of the movement are similar to the actual game. So I could have I could have a pitcher in baseball throw a ball, which has good coupling, good information, and have you swing with hit the ball with one hand or with a tennis racket, right? That's low action fidelity because it's a different movement pattern, right? So for me, you need to think about those three things. Sometimes this is divided into functionality and fidelity. I like to look at it as in those three things. So what does previous research tell us about the importance of representative design? I'll come back to this. And as an example, before I get to that, in baseball, I've been talking about, right, we can have degrees of representativeness all the way from just doing a pitch recognition on your phone with an app, which is very low representative, hitting off a tee, right? It has some aspects of the swing, but it's decoupled, doesn't have the information there. Hitting off a pitching machine, as I mentioned, is the next level up. Hitting off a real pitcher is the highest level of representative design for hitting, right? Previous research has shown that having low representative design, it can cause problems. In particular, it can cause different patterns of kinematics, different information movement patterns, people learning different strategies that might not work in the real game. And my baseball example hinted at that, right? If you hit off a pitching machine, you're going to learn a strategy, swing as soon as the ball is a certain size, that's not going to work in the game. So this has kind of been borne out in the research. Ross Pinder and colleagues have shown, for example, in cricket, when people hit off a pitching machine, they produce very different kinematics, in particular in terms of stepping and moving forward and back to hit the ball, than they do when they're actually hitting off a real pitcher. There's also studies both in tennis and volleyball showing that if you use the very common practice of training the ball toss, so in both of those sports, it's common to train people to do the ball toss, throw the ball up in the air, decouple it from the actual stroke. So they just throwing the ball without actually swinging. And there's been studies to show that when you do that, you produce very different patterns of movement. The ball toss trajectory is very different than when you're not going to hit it versus when you're going to hit it, not surprisingly. So these could be potential problems, right? And these are likely to be training. Like if I train this way for a long time, it's going to lead to questionable transfer because I'm going to learn a movement solution that might not work in the actual environment I'm going to compete in. In this study I want to talk about today, which is by McHugh and Nick Waddy, published in the Journal of Expertise, they looked at varying degrees of representativeness of baseball hitting practice. They were in particular, I think, mostly partially because of practical reasons, but also I think it's an important question, really focused on more of the short-term effect of representativeness, right? So we could look at how does representative design affect long-term skill acquisition, right? If I train for 6 weeks off a pitching machine, how does that differ from training 6 weeks off a real pitcher? In this study, they were looking more at the short-term acute effects, right? So if I warm up against a real pitcher versus I warm up on a tee, how is that going to affect my immediate performance, right? Which I think is a fair question. Largely because what we can look at in there is, of course, we can look at the issue of calibration, right? Which I've talked about a lot on the podcast before, right? We know that even for experienced athletes, for very skilled baseball players, skilled performance requires constant recalibration to the conditions because the conditions are always changing. You have to recalibrate your information movement control law. Baseball coaches and players will commonly refer to this as getting your timing down. That's essentially calibration. You're not learning a new hitting strategy. You're not learning anything new. You're recalibrating your existing things, right? So there's various ways that you could do this. As the authors point out, right? You could try to recalibrate your swing before the game by hitting off a tee, hitting off a pitching machine, hitting off a coach, etc. In this study, what they looked at was these different ways of warming up, essentially. They looked at players' decision rather than their actual hitting performance. They looked at their players' decision making and gaze behavior. So they're looking at these short-term effects. So what they expected to find, hypothesized based on those earlier studies I was talking about, was that the further you get from lower representativeness, so hitting off a tee, for example, is going to have more negative influence on gaze behavior and decision-making as compared to higher representative drills, like hitting off a pitcher. That's their basic hypothesis. So in this study, they took 28 college-level players of various levels. They're in 2 tiers. They used a between subjects design. So they had 4 groups. They're split into 4 groups with 7 per condition. So a little low on the N, which it could be a limitation, that were going to warm up in different ways. So each of them had 20 pitch warm-ups, 20 warm-ups. The control group just did what are called dry swings. So that's swinging a bat with no ball present at all. There was a stationary tee group who hit a ball off of a tee, as you commonly do in baseball. Then there was a pitching machine group who hit off a pitching machine set at 85 miles an hour. Then there was a group that hit off pitches thrown by a coach. So you had these 4 groups. Right after they warmed up this way. And right after that, they did a couple different things, right? They did one main kind of test task. This involved the batters were standing in front of a large projection screen wearing an eye tracker. And what they were doing was watching videos of pitches, okay, different pitches, different locations, types of pitches. And what they were asked to do is swing at the pitch if it was a strike. There was 3 types of pitches: a fastball, curveball, and changeup. Okay. Immediately after they swung, they were asked to verbally indicate what type of pitch it was and what quadrant it was in the strike zone, right? So if it was upper left quadrant, they'd say number 1. And while they were doing this, their gaze behavior was measured, right? So that was kind of the main test, right? So it wasn't a pre-post test design. It was only this post-test measurement after the warm-up, because it's not really a training study. The main dependent variables were the response accuracy, how well they could identify the pitches and the quadrant, and various gaze metrics, right? One of the main ones they were interested in is in baseball batting, right? It's really important you get your eyes to the release point, right? So a pitcher is doing a big windup. The release point is the point in space where the ball is going to come out of their hand, right? Hitting successfully, it's really critical that you get your eyes to that spot as quickly as possible, right? So you can pick up the ball and track it after it's been released. So they measured the time it took a batter to get their eyes to the release point. They also measured their final fixation duration, kind of a quiet eye kind of measure, and various other things too you can look up in the paper. What did they find? No, not in terms of significance, nothing, right? They found no effects of the warm-up condition on any of the dependent measures of accuracy or eye gaze behavior. This is perhaps not too surprising because it's difficult with the low number of subjects, and a between subject design is going to create kind of more variability between the groups, right? So you might have, just by chance, the 7 people that warmed up with the T have different gaze behavior than the 7 people that warmed up against the coach, right? So having a between subjects design, you always take that chance, right? So you're kind of stacking the cards against finding significance with this kind of design from the start. But they did find some very interesting trends, even though they didn't come out significant. And one of the biggest ones they found, if you're watching, you can see here, is that players that warmed up with either the coach thrown ball or the pitching machine, if you looked at how quickly they got their eyes to the release point, on the first few pitches, they were there quicker than the control group and the T group, right? So it suggests perhaps that they're calibrating their gaze behavior a little better. Like they're getting to this quicker recalibration than the groups that are using less representative practice. But of course, as I said, this was not a significant effect, and of course, it needs to be factored up. So overall, I think this was a really interesting study, and I think this is a really interesting question. What are the consequences of different degrees of representativeness? What do they have, right? In some ways, it's a hard thing to study in the long term because we expect to increase representativeness as we go through training. So this kind of effects on warm-up is a really interesting question, I think. I think, obviously, beyond the kind of things I pointed out, obviously you would like to actually see the effects of these things on actual hitting performance, the timing of the swing relative to the ball and things like that. But I think this is a really interesting study nonetheless that addresses quite an interesting question about representative design. Okay, that's it for this review. Thank you for joining me. And if you want to find more information about all the things I'm doing, please check out perceptionaction.com. Thanks, and cheers for now.